Hi, I am Liz Powell. I am the founder and head of G2G Consulting, which stands for Government to Growth. My role is to kick things off today, and then I will pass to my esteemed colleagues and some amazing experts in advocacy that will share their stories, their insights, their advice. Today, we are all about national advocacy and funding for nonprofits. Next slide, please. This is the agenda of what we'll cover, some basics on us at G2G, just as a refresher for folks. Government basics, we want to make sure you understand both the appropriations and authorizing process within Congress. Talk about how to work with the White House and federal departments, and give valuable tips on advocacy from those who have led amazing campaigns at the national level to make a difference, to access funding. And we'll close out with some takeaways. Next slide, please. Before I go any further, I need to make sure you know this is being recorded, and we will send you the recording and the slides after the webinar today. So you will get a copy of that. A little bit of background on G2G, again, Government to Growth. It's a firm I started 16 years ago after working on Capitol Hill for several years as a legislative director. I worked in a lot of human service issues, a lot of health policy, and I managed appropriations. And I started G2G in 2007 after meeting some amazing folks in both the for-profit and nonprofit world, all change makers trying to make a difference, but not knowing how to navigate government, how to get funded, how to shape policies, regulations. And so since 2007, we have now led many advocacy campaigns, lots of State House days, Capitol Hill days, congressional briefings, receptions, media events. We've written legislation, helped do grassroots mobilization, and built really valuable relationships on Capitol Hill and within the administration. We are bipartisan, working across the aisle. We think a lot of the causes are very bipartisan. It's just a matter of approach and how working with offices. Most of all, that bottom number people like to see, we've raised over $528 million in government funding for the folks we work with. In fact, we've got another $60 million pending in the current appropriations process at the federal level. Next slide, please. These are some of the folks we've worked with over the years. We've worked with many more nonprofits, but we thought it would be helpful to highlight some of the national organizations like the Shepherd Foundation, the Women's Health Access Matters Organization, Mom Congress, America View. Then there's more state and local organizations like the Girl Scouts. You're going to hear from them soon. We've got University of Cincinnati, the PASS Foundation focused on STEM education, Virginia Bio, many of the Bio State chapters, and even some municipalities. We work with Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, and some others. So the point of this slide is not only to brag about how excited we are for the folks we work with, but also to share the vast range of nonprofits that can benefit from advocacy and engagement with our federal government. They want to hear from you, and that is what today is all about. So with that, I will pass it on to my colleague.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Cooper, and I am a Government Affairs Director in G2G's Washington, D.C. office. I'm very passionate about public engagement and federal policymaking, and hope to share some of the knowledge I've gained working in this space with you today. So just a bit of background on myself. I joined the G2G team earlier this year after spending the past 12 years on Capitol Hill, working for two members of Congress, two members of the Appropriations Committee. I held almost every position in a congressional office other than communications director. So spent time as both legislative director and chief of staff. And most recently, I served as chief appropriations counsel for an appropriations cardinal, which is just a fancy term for the top Democrat or Republican on an appropriations subcommittee. So we have some great speakers to come today, so I'll be relatively quick. Try not to overwhelm you with information, but don't worry. We will share the slides and the presentation link after the webinar concludes, and you can always reach out to me or anyone on the G2G team for more information. So before turning the mic over to my colleague, Katie Collins, I will cover the basic structure and functions of the federal government and dive into the legislative branch and spend some time talking about the appropriations and the authorization processes, which I know can be a little confusing and complicated if you are not immersed in that work on a regular basis. So you probably remember learning about the three branches of government and the balances of power in school, but it is important to truly understand the functions of the branches and the key players to be effective in your efforts to influence policy and make real change. And again, during this presentation, we'll specifically focus on Congress, which writes legislation, and the White House, which signs the legislation into law or rejects it and returns it to Congress. Next slide, please. So to set the stage, Congress is made up of two chambers, the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The House consists of 435 members who represent congressional districts across the country. The number of districts per state does vary greatly. For example, California has 52 districts, and Alaska and Delaware each have one congressional district. There is some variation, but each district includes roughly 700,000 constituents. The Senate, on the other hand, only has 100 senators, and each state has 2 senators. So very different from the House. Again, Alaska has a population of about 730,000, and Delaware has about 1 million residents, has as much voting power in the Senate as California, with a population hovering around 40 million. And if you haven't already, you should familiarize yourself with your representative and your 2 senators. Each of them has a unique background, religious affiliation, previous occupation, military service record, and length of congressional service. Doing that type of research can make a huge difference in the quality of interaction that you have with the congressperson and their staff. Next slide, please. The current Congress, which is the 118th Congress, is essentially balanced between the 2 major political parties. As you can see on the screen, the Democrats hold a 2-seat majority in the Senate, as the 3 independent senators caucus with the Democrats, and the Republicans hold a 10-seat majority in the House. What that means is for legislation to reach the president, it must truly be bipartisan. It's also a good reason to establish relationships with folks on both sides of the political aisle. You will need buy-in from both Republicans and Democrats to make progress and maintain that progress during such a period of divided government. And frankly, most senators and members of Congress seek out bipartisan opportunities. They may not make more noise on cable TV than the show horses in Congress, but trust me, they are doing the hard work to keep the country moving. Next slide. So there are 2 main categories of federal spending: what's known as mandatory spending, and that covers entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, and discretionary spending, which is provided and controlled through what are called appropriations acts. And most funding requests that you'll engage Congress on will flow through the annual appropriations bills and the Senate and House appropriations committees, which are in charge of drafting those bills. So as you can see on the screen, there are 12 appropriations subcommittees responsible for funding different functions of the government, such as defense spending, transportation spending, and so on. And because each subcommittee has unique jurisdiction over government agencies and policies, it's really important for you to get to know the members of that particular subcommittee and the chair and ranking member of the specific subcommittee your priority or priorities fall under. For instance, if your goal is to push for, increased funding for cancer research through the Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health, it's important for you to engage those in Congress with the most power to directly impact those spending levels. So in this case, that would be members of the Labor, Health, and Human Services Appropriations Subcommittee, which is one of the 12 and can be seen toward the bottom of the screen. Next slide, please. So you're probably asking yourself, when does Congress and the Appropriations Committee do all of this work? I don't really hear about it on the news. It's not typically covered. So the annual appropriations process typically begins with the president's budget request submission to Congress. And it's helpful for nonprofits and other advocates to review the budget documents and see how each department and agency is prioritizing its programs for the year. Now, the president is required by law to submit the budget request to Congress in early February each year, but that doesn't always happen, especially during the first year of a new administration as they work to establish priorities. Sometimes those budget documents don't make their way to the Hill until early March or even later. Also beginning in February through the spring months, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees will hold their annual budget hearings with agency and outside witnesses. And I think it's important to note that the Appropriations Committees don't always wait for the budget requests to begin these hearings. So you can't always use the president's budget being released as a marker of when to connect with Congress. Congress then produces a budget resolution setting an overall top line number or a cap on discretionary spending for the year. Each chamber drafts its own budget resolution, and then the chambers work out the differences. However, sometimes Congress does skip this process, this step, and moves directly to appropriations action. So while the appropriations committees are finishing the budget hearings I mentioned earlier, the committees also open an online platform for members of Congress and senators to submit their appropriations requests for consideration. And that system can't be accessed by those outside of the congressional offices. So again, it is key for you to establish relationships with these elected officials and their staff to make real progress on the issues that you care about. Once the requests from senators and members are reviewed, the subcommittees then draft and what we call mark up or consider the spending bills. And that typically happens between June and September of any given year. And once you get through the committee stage of the process, the full House and Senate will vote on those spending bills. And then the House and Senate have to work out those differences between the measures before a consolidated spending package, also known as an omnibus, can be sent to the president for signature. And there are different things that you can do at the various stages of the appropriations process to advocate for your priorities. So, for example, when the committee is conducting those budget hearings that I mentioned earlier, you can work with a member of the subcommittee to ask the agency witness about your priority. You can also work with a friendly office who is supportive of your priority to draft an amendment to the spending bill to offer at the committee or on the chamber floor. So again, very important to start early and establish relationships with key members of Congress and their staff. Next slide, please. There are three main categories of appropriations requests: programmatic requests, language requests, and community project funding or congressionally directed spending requests. So programmatic requests are really the simplest requests made to the committee. These requests express general support for funding a particular program, request an unspecified increase or decrease in spending for a program. They can request that the committee completely eliminate funding for a program or provide a specific funding amount for consideration. Language requests, on the other hand, can help spotlight a particular issue or direct an agency to take certain actions or study something and report back to the committee within a certain time frame. And then finally, CPF and CDS requests, which were previously known as earmarks, if you've heard that term in the past, provide a specific amount of funding authority to a named entity, so to a specific entity. And nonprofits are eligible for this funding, as are state and local governmental entities. For-profits are not eligible for this type of funding. So again, establishing and building relationships with the congressional offices can really make or break whether or not you receive their support for your priorities during this process. Next slide. So now we talked about appropriations bills. I'll speak briefly about the other type of bill that typically moves through Congress, what is known as an authorization bill. So authorization bills perform a different function than appropriation measures. Authorization acts establish, continue, or in some cases modify agencies or programs. And many programs are authorized for 5-year periods. So for example, an authorization bill may establish or modify a particular program within the Department of Health and Human Services. And that particular authorization act may also authorize appropriations or spending for that program and set a cap on how much money can be spent for that program in any given fiscal year. You know, often it's critical to have bipartisan co-sponsors on authorization measures and stakeholder support, which can be expressed through things like congressional testimony, email campaigns, or letters to the committee of jurisdiction requesting that the committee pass the bill. And the legislative committee of jurisdiction, which varies depending on what type of agencies are being impacted by the legislation, will often conduct a hearing on the bill to gather additional information on the issue before moving ahead with a markup. And finally, the Congressional Budget Office will also release a cost estimate, or sometimes it's called a score, of the bill, which is really just an estimate of the impact on the federal budget should the legislation become law. Next slide. Finally, there's many different ways to work with Congress to make progress on the issues that you care about. I'm not going to cover each line that's on your screen there, but you can work with congressional caucuses, which are groups of senators or representatives who come together to pursue shared goals, to hold a congressional briefing on an issue. And trust me, there are congressional caucuses on almost anything you can think of. There have been caucuses for mental health and substance use disorder, and there have also been caucuses for rock and roll. So it really runs the gamut. Another way that you can get involved is inviting the senator or member of Congress to see some of the great work being done in their state or district, it could be an opportunity for both your organization and the member to get some positive media coverage. So just some other things to think about, different ways to engage members of Congress and their staff to help make progress on the issues you care about. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Katie Collins.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Collins. I'm Vice President at G2G Consulting. I have a background specifically in health policy. I spent 6 years in the Obama-Biden White House, finishing that time as part of the original iteration of the Cancer Moonshot Task Force, and continued on with Biden's team as program director of his Biden Cancer Initiative for several years after that, before working on congressional advocacy for the National Institutes of Health, and then finally joining Liz and her wonderful team here at G2G. So that is me in a nutshell. And I'm here to touch on the White House and federal agencies. Chris did a great job going through some of the details about working with Congress. Congress often gets much of the attention in government relations and advocacy work, but I just want to touch on the benefits of working with the White House and agencies as well. As many of you may know, the agencies do have a really big role in shaping federal policy. Congressional efforts are often focused on influencing agency policy. So we often combine that congressional work with engaging directly with relevant agency offices and personnel. Broadly speaking, agencies control federal funding opportunities like grants, contracts, and pilot programs, but mainly they shape government priorities and the development and execution of policy. So this is where lots of policy is happening, which is why it can be helpful to engage directly with the agency on your issue. And this can look like working with CMS, for example, if you're looking to shape coverage policies, or working with an NIH, the National Institutes of Health, to shape funding priorities, or working with the FDA on clearance issues. Each agency has its own space, and you want to target that agency that has jurisdiction over what you're looking to do. In addition to shaping policy, this type of work helps to elevate your organization's profile with government and can help open doors that might not otherwise be available. And don't forget the White House. I come from the White House, so I, was on the receiving end of a lot of advocacy work. Again, and particularly in the health space. But what does the White House do, and why would we want to engage with the White House? The White House influences the federal budget, as Chris mentioned. The first step of the budget process is the release of the president's budget, which communicates the priorities of that White House and that administration. So if you're looking for funding and you can get that funding included in the president's budget, that goes a long way in getting Congress to take your request and your efforts seriously. You can shape priorities, programming, and policy directly with the White House. They're kind of the head, sitting on top of all of the different agencies, and have the ability to take a top-down approach that, if you can get them to do that, is very fast and effective. You can educate. You want to elevate your organization and your issue. So meeting with the White House helps to educate those decision makers and elevate you and your policy goals. And it's also a great opportunity for media coverage. If you're meeting with the White House, if you're going to the White House, we had groups of advocates come all of the time. In the age of social media, having that photo, whether you're in the EEOB or you get to take a tour as part of your work, that's something that can really help propel your organization to the top. So don't ignore federal advocacy at the department and White House level, in addition to Congress. And we can move to the next slide. So we are going to shift gears a little bit and move into our advocacy in action section, where we're going to speak with several experienced federal advocates who have been very successful in their government engagement efforts. So let's go to the next slide. First up, we are going to feature a conversation with G2G's Dr. Aditya Girish and Brandy Lee Sawyer, who is an amazing advocate in the cancer space. And they're going to talk a bit about her work to expand coverage for diagnostic testing and how she has worked really successfully with both Aditya and Liz at G2G to be an extremely effective change maker. Brandy Lee is someone I admire very much, so I'm excited to share this video with you today.
There's no sound.
Yeah, we need some sound.
The lobbyists coming together to share their experiences of pushing forward, advocating, building relationships, and making a difference in working with government. So without further ado, what I'd love to do is start off with brief introductions. If you each could give your background. So we'll start with you, Brandy Lee.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you guys so much for having me and allowing me to be part of this discussion and to share my experience and insights into advocating. So I have been a mom for a very long time. I do have a bachelor degree in environmental studies, but mom is probably the best title I've had. And what launched me into advocacy is my son Finn, who battled a very aggressive cancer for 2.5 years of his very brief life. Finn was diagnosed with rhabdomyosarcoma in 2016 when he was only 1.5. And he battled for nearly 2.5 years, constantly relapsing, constantly being on treatment, having major surgeries that left him unable to walk. And he continued on, we continued on, but in the end, it wasn't enough. And Finn ultimately succumbed to the cancer, and he died in 2018. And so I'm a bereaved mom turned advocate, and I take my grief and what would be unproductive anger, and I turn it into something very productive, which is advocating for what cancer patients really need in order to survive.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Aditya, could you share your background, please?
Of course. My name is Aditya Girish. I'm a government affairs manager with G2G Consulting. My background is quite a bit different from a lot of my other colleagues at G2G. I'm actually a scientist by training. I was pursuing my PhD in biomedical engineering when I came across the opportunity to work with these great people at G2G part-time, first as an intern while still pursuing my degree. So I was really interested in how science and innovation, policy and government, and nonprofits and business all sort of connected. And this opportunity was really the perfect nexus for that, for pursuing that interest. And so my responsibilities at G2G initially centered on helping a lot of our clients and nonprofits as well look for opportunities in the federal government for funding and making connections. And then more recently, 1.5 years ago, I joined the firm full time. I primarily, although not exclusively, work with groups that are in the nonprofit and bioscience space. I sort of unintentionally got into advocacy. I didn't really understand what a big part of the job it was until I started here full time. A lot of what I do is really working with folks like Brandy Lee, amplifying their voices, helping to translate key points and messages in a concise, strategic manner to decision makers in our government in order to make a difference.
Great backgrounds that you both have. I think it's so powerful to have the advocate and the scientist coming together to educate and work with Congress. So we do have a lot of nonprofits on today, and I'm sure they're very curious about the exact causes that you guys were working on together. Do you want to share that with us, Brandy Lee?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm with the Shepherd Foundation, and the Shepherd Foundation started as a rare cancer foundation, pan-rare cancer foundation. And we were very interested in research funding for rare cancers and coverage for molecular diagnostics. But more recently, we've been focused on all of that pan-rare cancer space. But we also figured out that there is a huge roadblock and for patients getting the care that they need. And that is really the understanding of what molecular diagnostics is. And molecular diagnostics has many terms. The other one is next generation sequencing. But that is really a key to your whole cancer journey. It's like the thing that should happen in the beginning. And the longer that we went, the longer we talked to patients, the longer we kind of delved into everything, we discovered that people really have no idea what that is, and they don't even know how to ask for it. And so when we were brainstorming, we just were like, yeah, we really need to kind of hone in on this. And I know for a fact, I mean, it's been my soapbox with Finn's journey, and one of the biggest, I don't know what to call it, but just one of the saddest things about his journey is the fact that he did not get this molecular diagnostics at the time of diagnosis. And the more that I learned and the more I talked to organizations like you guys, and the longer I worked at Shepherd, and the more I talked to other organizations and scientists and doctors, the more I understood the key that holds for us, that molecular diagnostics holds for us. And so, you know, when we were all talking too, we were just like, yeah, we definitely have to do something about this. And beyond my own journey and my own anger as to why Finn didn't get this, there are hundreds of thousands of patients that are not going to get this and that have not gotten this, and they needlessly die. And so that has been our rallying cry, and a huge cause, if not my one and only cause, is to get patients molecular diagnostics at the time of diagnosis.
And Aditya, can you lay out kind of more like bullet point lists of some of the issues we worked on, sort of like appropriations as compared to the authorization? That might be helpful so people understand the different ways that you can be doing advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So working with Shepherd, a lot of our work centers on the federal appropriations process. So for those of you who aren't aware, this is how Congress essentially allocates money to fund the government agencies for the upcoming fiscal year. And so while there is obviously lots of numbers and tables and spreadsheets allocating what money goes where, they also contain really detailed language explaining Congress's intent in how they are funding these different agencies and what they would like these agencies to prioritize. And so it should be noted that agencies operate on congressional intent. So that really shapes those agencies' programs, their priorities, and funding opportunities that they put out every single year. It should be noted that advocacy groups, can really help members of Congress shape this process, sort of expounding on impacts in specific communities, among specific demographic groups, and really building champions to include specific lines, whether they are accompanied by funding or not, just to influence the process of what government should be prioritizing. And so with Shepherd, we found that because this was a yearly process, it was a really good vehicle to really latch onto and make change as quickly as possible. So a early target for our work together was the appropriations bill that funds services for veterans. Veterans were particularly impacted disproportionately by rare cancers, and there was a lot of need in that space. And so we were successful within a year just to get language into that veterans funding bill, emphasizing rare cancer and expanding molecular diagnostics for that group. And so that was sort of like a initial stepping stone. We built upon that success. In following years, we were able to get language in the bill that funds the Defense Department and defense programs to get a new line for rare cancer research in the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, which was huge. It's essentially setting up a new program. And likewise, we've worked on similar bills funding the NIH and the FDA, again, emphasizing the need for molecular diagnostics and additional grants for rare cancers. And so throughout that process, it's not just sending suggestions, and it's really a process of education where you really work with members of Congress, senators and their staff, as well as folks on the agency side to an extent. And so this really helps raise the salience of these issues. You meet with them, you talk about what you're concerned about, and why your appropriations request is necessary to meet a specific need and how it ties in to that member or that senator's priorities. And so in that process, you're really building a network of allies in the government. And it's something you can really count on year after year once you started the process in earnest. And so we've been very successful on the appropriation side, but as Liz was alluding to earlier, we also were able to work on more of an authorization bill as well to meet the need that Brandy Lee had spoke about earlier, the need for expanded access and awareness of molecular diagnostic technologies for cancer patients. So we actually have a bill in Congress right now, pending before Congress, called the Finn-Sawyer Act, named after Brandy Lee's late son. And specifically, it's to expand molecular diagnostic coverage for patients covered by CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as kids on the Children's Health Insurance Program. So this was again, a multi-year, multi-Congress effort. So those efforts started in the last Congress where we first worked on putting together an initial bill that was pretty wide in scope, actually. And this year it's more of a tailored bill focused on molecular diagnostics, where we were able to get all 4 leaders of the Congressional Rare Disease Caucus, a bipartisan, bicameral group of legislators. So Representatives Bilirakis and Matsui in the House, and Senators Klobuchar and Wicker to move this legislation forward. And so these legislators were chosen very specifically because of the aims of their caucus aligned with what we were trying to do. But again, we really have to talk with these staffers, convince them of why this legislation was necessary, and what we wanted to achieve and how it was in line with their existing priorities. So there's a lot of back and forth, putting together language, drafting it, working with the staffers, tailoring it. And still, once it was finalized and introduced, we still have to work with staffers again over the course of several months and even years to get the word out about the bill, to build support and build co-sponsorships. That includes techniques such as holding congressional briefings for staffers, as well as having additional follow-up meetings in person, as well as bringing in other outside stakeholders to advocate for the passage of this bill. So it's a really long process, but it can be super rewarding if you do it correctly.
Thank you, that's helpful. So I keep hearing education, relationship development are 2 key things that you did repeatedly, and that the appropriations process feeds into the authorization process. So by building those relationships on an annual basis and submitting language and funding requests, you're now building these champions that can then help you with the authorization bill. So that's really helpful to hear how it all works. And so this could be for any cause, not just the cancer cause that you 2 are very engrossed in. So I think we're going to wrap up pretty quickly here, but just before we do you have any big surprises? Like, what surprised you the most in doing this work? I think that would be helpful for folks to hear. How about you, Brandy Lee?
Yeah, for sure. The biggest thing for me was that I think growing up, or you just, even as a young adult, you hear things on the news, you hear things in the media that government is this big, scary monolith that's like removed from the day-to-day of everyday people, and that they're not going to listen, and that they don't really care about what we have to say. But the biggest thing for me was that, I mean, people on the Hill were moved to tears by hearing Finn's story. And it wasn't any special way I delivered it. I just told Finn's story. I told his heartbreaking, tragic story that has happened to so many cancer patients, and their families are left to live without them. And it doesn't have to be that way. And so it just takes some personal connection and sharing your story with the people on Congress, with our lawmakers, to let them know exactly what we need. And they've been so responsive. Even the ones that say, I'm trying not to be emotional, but they still have tears, rolling down their face, trying to keep it together. Because at the end of the day, we are all human. We are all going to the Hill with important human causes, and we're just relating to one another as human beings. And so sharing our stories is so vital. And I couldn't have done it without G2G. You guys have been amazing. You've been amazing at coaching me and encouraging me to share my story, and helping when it's doing the research to know how to relate to them, what their background is, and just finding those personal connections is super, super helpful. The same as if you're going to go out and try to, I don't know, make a friend or something, you're gonna kind of talk about things that you can relate on and tell them about you and your story. And so it's humans. We're all humans, and connection and personal stories.
That's really helpful. Personal stories and connection, and then repeat. It sounds like a lot of repeating. You have to go back again and again. So Aditya, what do you have to add to that real quick?
Yeah, really, Brandy Lee said it best. You really need a story. I mean, in my training as a scientist, we were always instructed, you can't just throw facts and figures at people. That doesn't really have an impact. You need facts and figures, but you really need to also tie it into a human story, how it impacts real people, and how what you're advocating for really makes a difference for those real people every single time you're communicating. Otherwise, it's just going to fall flat. I think also I would say definitely the repetition is important. You might be frustrating. You might think, oh, I talked to this person. They had a good response to me. But very often you need to keep following up over and over again, because members of Congress, their staff, folks in other parts of the government, they're busy, and it takes time to really build an advocate. But once you do, the payoffs are quite significant. So I would say don't be afraid or discouraged by repetition. It's just part of the process, and you need to embrace it. Lastly, I would say you also need to have different versions of your story, what you're advocating for. Not the substance, but just how you modulate your communication with different folks. You're going to meet all sorts of people who are very seasoned veterans of policy, people who have no idea what you're talking about. You really need to change the exact framework in which you tell your story just to meet those different audience members. So important to do your homework before you go into those conversations.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up with that. Thank you both so much. It was so insightful. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks for having
All right. Well, first off, I want to thank Brandy Lee for her willingness to share her story. Brandy Lee is amazing, and I think of her and Finn often in my advocacy work. So thank you. Next up, I want to turn to a conversation with Girl Scout CEO Jane Christensen and Director of Girl Experience Fallon Pulley to discuss their successful advocacy work at the federal level. So I think we can pull down the slides, and I think we're just going to talk. So I want to start with Jane and Fallon. Do you guys both want to do a quick introduction? And then I have some questions to spark our discussion.
Sure. I'm Jane Christensen. I'm the CEO of Girl Scouts of Northeast Ohio.
Thanks, Jane.
And I'm Fallon Pulley. I'm the Director of Girl Experience for Girl Scouts of Northeast Ohio.
All right, short and sweet. I love it. We're going to get into the meat of our conversation. And I want to start with a question for Jane. Jane, you have done an amazing job at engaging your entire organization in your advocacy program and developing an advocacy strategy that includes everyone. It includes your board. How did you engage leadership across your organization? And did you need to educate your board on how to do effective advocacy?
Absolutely. I mean, it really first started with the great idea, and that's our transformational project to build a $7 million STEM Center of Excellence at one of our camps. And the reason that we got engaged in STEM is because our national organization made it one of the pillars for all of Girl Scouts, because of the fact that even though women are 50% of the workforce, they're only 28% of the STEM workers. And we really want to make sure that those starting to fill that gap and the talent pipeline in this area starts with girls and really getting them interested in taking on STEM opportunities. So now that we had this good idea, and we felt like it was a wonderful idea for the community, we really ask our girls to discover, connect, and take action. And what we mean by that is discover things they're passionate about, connect those passions to the community, and then take action to make lasting change. And the board went through some self-discovery around this idea. So what are we doing to discover, connect, and take action? And that's where the STEM Center was really born. So our first steps then, after everybody was on board with that concept, we had never gotten funding at a state or government level through lobbying. So we really had to have G2G as a partner. And the first thing that we really started with is the grassroots part of it, inviting members to come out to the property, get all of the board members to write letters and emails, put those forms together. We had a place on our website where they could find out where their districts were so they could write to the right people. And we also pointed out to the girls and the volunteers what badges were available, because we all want a little reward for doing some things, right? So we pointed out to them what things that this would count for towards badge earning as well.
I love that. I remember my badging efforts as a young Girl Scout. So the reward system is definitely helpful. Working, with your board, how did you educate them on how to be effective advocates? And what was key to getting their support for your advocacy work and really endorsing this strategy?
Well, it really wasn't a hard sell, because they all, really started with the project. And since they wanted to do the project, they were open to training, to sample letters, to opportunities to move forward.
Great. You didn't hit a lot of roadblocks, which is wonderful. Fallon, I'd like to ask you a question. So you have become very engaged, meeting directly with members of Congress, other public officials too, but I've seen you in action. You know, you have talked directly with Chantel Brown here in Cleveland, Amelia Sykes down in Akron. I've seen you meet leader Hakeem Jeffries. So you are out there doing this face-to-face meeting with these high-level public officials. What have you found to be most effective in these interactions? You know, how do you talk to members of Congress?
Thanks, Katie. I think the best thing to do is honestly to keep it short and sweet, right? They have a limited amount of time. So giving them an opportunity for us to share our story and tell them about all of the amazing things that we do. And, you know, just making sure that we can connect with them, you know, outside of those spaces as well, sharing information and taking an opportunity to just continue to tell them all about all of the big ideas that we have and, you know, just bringing them along for the ride for a lot of the things that we have.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, you're very good at it. So we're going to have you doing a lesson here. Jane, you have built up a strong list of diverse partners in your advocacy efforts. How have you used this list of partners to amplify your message and really get the word out about what you're doing?
Well, I think one of the things was really to start contacting people early, anybody who would have any kind of connection to a project like this. And back up a little bit for the STEM Center, the Girl Scouts will use it all summer long during summer camp and then weekends during the school year. But then weekdays during the school year, we're going to be inviting boys and girls from local school districts to take advantage of the facility since we don't really use it then. So this becomes really a community project and a community resource for everyone to use. It's not just specific to Girl Scout, but it has a wide reach. So we got people like educators and Akron Public School superintendent, to mayors, the mayor of Peninsula, where the facility is going to be held, the mayor of Boston Heights, which is an adjacent community. Our state reps were very keen and helpful in writing to congressional contacts as well. That would be Bill Romer and Casey Weinstein, who were both very helpful. Some of our board members who held other key positions, like one of our board members, Dr. Vivian von Gruningen, is also the head of Northeast Ohio Medical University. So she's the program director. So to have those kind of people write those kind of letters. We also have a connection with America Makes because we do other STEM programming. They've helped us with these kind of things. If you're not familiar with that, that's a big federal arm that it really is pushing additive manufacturing, which is kind of 3D printing and all the things that aren't traditional manufacturing. So to have them, they've co-produced programming with them for them to endorse this project and say, this is a space that we're competent in. And then also some other agencies like Great Lakes Biomimicry. And the theme of the building is going to be biomimicry. If you're not familiar with that, that's looking to nature as inspiration to solve today's problems. So we are putting this facility in a 350-acre camp, which is the only Girl Scout camp that is in a national park in the country. So it has another adjacent thousands of acres. So we really want to take advantage of that environment to really inspire kids to move forward and look to see what nature can do in order to inspire them to take on technological problems. So they were very keen to help us out as well. And then aerospace. Aerospace is a really big industry in this area. So I'd urge you to look to see who the key players and aerospace industries are looking to biomimicry to redesign. Boeing's going through a process right now, redesigning all their airplanes. So they were very excited to see that we were introducing these concepts to youth that are in the area with the hope of then filling the talent pipeline.
Absolutely. Thank you. Fallon, I want to ask you a little bit more about engaging directly with members. Can you speak a little bit to the importance of sharing your personal story or the personal, the story of the girls that you work with, and how does that, how do members respond to that? And do you think that's been key to getting them engaged and supportive?
Yes, absolutely. It's all about sharing your story, how your story started, maybe with the organization, but also what we do as an organization. I had an opportunity to meet with quite a few elected officials with Jane. We took cookies out and about. which is always a win. But, we had an opportunity to testify in front of some House committees as well as some Senate committees. And in that space, we were also able to work with one of our girl alumni members and bring her along for the journey as well. And she was able to share her personal story about Girl Scouts. And it's all about, letting folks know it's the human experience. And we're not just this organization that you see, the cookies and the crafts and all of that stuff. There's more tied to it than that.
Absolutely. So you mentioned going to Capitol Hill. Jane, you took a trip to Washington, D.C. to do meetings directly on Capitol Hill earlier this year. Could you talk about what you thought about doing that and how it was an important part of your advocacy efforts? And Chris Cooper, I want to invite you to put your video on here because I know you and Jane did this together, so you may have some thoughts to add too. But I'll turn over to you and to Chris.
Such an incredible partner because really my trip to Capitol Hill was sparked by the fact that a local, there's a big rubber and chemical kind of contingent of people in the Akron area, polymers, all that kind of stuff. And they were going as a group of about, I don't know, there was 12 to 14 of them. And I'm like, okay, well, that sounds like a good idea. And Chris said right away, do not do that. Come by yourself. He said, those people, it's too big of a group. The offices are really tiny. There's not going to be room for them to sit in there. And you will see that they will be out in the hallway. We ended up going on the same day as this group from, a neighboring city. And we walked through the halls the whole day, and they were holding these meetings in the hallway. Very hard to hear, very hard to get an individual message across, while I was being escorted with Chris into the offices and sitting there and having a great one-on-one conversation. So I will say that he saved us from wasting a whole day, because I don't think what was done in the big group was as effective as what we were able to do in the small group. So just a very small example, but a very important one.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to
Yeah,
add
I was going to say,
anything?
I'll just add to that. Jane and the Girl Scouts had done their homework ahead of time, which made a huge difference in a lot of these meetings. We were able to communicate to the offices information about the Girl Scouts footprint and impact in whatever congressional district we were visiting, or the state as a whole when we were meeting with the senators' offices. Jane mentioned the STEM Center of Excellence project. And, we thought, when we're going into a specific congressional office, does this member, care a lot about STEM education? Does this member care and prioritize diversity efforts? Does this member care about U.S. competitiveness with China and our other competitors? And doing some of that research, which we did, can help, direct you about how to approach communicating your project or your issue to that particular office. So I thought it was a great visit, a successful visit. We definitely did a lot of walking, and looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah, and I bet that the individual tailoring of those meetings, and you talked about doing the homework and understanding who cares about what, really helped get those offices on board, knowing what to target to build that support network that you're walking away with.
And the other thing that Jane did is, invited. Don't forget about district or state congressional staff. They play just as important of a role as staff that sit in the Capitol or the House and Senate buildings in DC. And the Girl Scouts had invited some of those state or district staffers to tour some of their facilities. And so being able to communicate that had happened is just another way to make a connection to the congressional offices. So
that's great. And just, want to thank, well, first of all, actually, I want to share a photo. So if we can pull our slide deck up for just a moment, I think we have a special photo from that day on the Hill. And I just want to invite Jane to talk to us a little bit about the two pictures that we see here.
Yeah. The one on the left is me actually visiting. I'm standing by the same staircase and in almost the same place that I visited as a 6th grade cadet, learning about government and camping. And we were doing a flag ceremony that day with our local elected official. And then there's me earlier this year in the same area. advocating for Girl Scouts. So what a special thing for this organization to offer me both of those opportunities, and for me to be able to impact the Girl Scouts of the future, to have this wonderful facility.
Thanks, Jane. I love that photo. That's fabulous. I am realizing that we have had such great conversation. We have 4 minutes left. So I'd like to turn to a couple questions, and these questions can be for me, for Chris, for Jane, Fallon, whoever you'd like to direct your question to. I will start with the first question in the box about, can nonpartisan groups legally encourage their members, to register to vote and to vote. I will preface this with, I'm not an attorney, but I don't believe there's anything wrong with urging your members to register, to get out and vote. I think the line is crossed when you're trying to tell them who to vote for. So I think that messaging of exercising your right to vote is perfectly fine. You don't want to get into specific direction on candidates or issues. All right, I'm just opening up my Q&A box here. Okay. So our organization has never done advocacy. We are not in a position to spend a lot of money or staff time in diving head in. Do you have any recommendations on where to start? So I'm realizing that in my excitement to get to questions, I think I skipped our wrap-up slide, and I apologize. So if we can put up our wrap-up slide, I think that gets to some of this question. So thank you. That spurs me to talk about this. Okay, because the first thing I was going to say was know your needs. What are you trying to achieve with your advocacy? To me, that is the biggest thing to help you allocate time and resources, is to know what you're looking to do. And I'm going to quickly just buzz through the rest of these. Understanding how the timing works and how the system works. All of this stuff happens on a schedule, as Chris alluded to, throughout the year. So knowing where you are in that cycle can also help you direct your work. You want to strategically target, public officials and agency leaders. Who are your reps, or who is the committee head with the issue that you're trying to work with, can help streamline some of that. Using strategic comms and messaging that effectively and quickly communicate your issue. This one I wish was underlined: build relationships and nourish them. Advocacy is all about relationship building and maintaining relationships. That's a huge part of this. And that's something that anybody, can do. I think it was Fallon, saying just being a human. We're all human, and sharing, that type of human interaction helps with those relationships. We talked about process. Invite your member of Congress or their staff, we mentioned their district director, district staff, to come to see your organization, to come to an event, really get them engaged. Engage the community you serve. That's huge. Constituent engagement can be a very big part in success. Be persistent, keep going. I think Brandy Lee talked about this. She and her organization, it was not overnight, it was over, 5 years, and what an incredible amount of progress they've made in that several years worth of work. Follow up and stay in touch, and be aware of politics. Always lots of things happening behind the scenes that influence how policy is being shaped. So my apologies for missing that slide, but that is the end of the presentation. So I want to say thank you. In our last minute, who at the White House should we reach out to? So you want to be reaching out to, just like we're talking about Congress, who in the White House has jurisdiction over that issue? Is it foreign policy, domestic policy? And that's something, G2G can always help, streamline that down, although those lists are publicly available, maybe not easily searchable. But yeah, you want to find someone who is working in an office that touches your issue. All right, I think that is it. We are on the hour. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the work that you do at your organizations. And thanks for being with us today. Thanks to Jane, to Fallon, and to Brandy Lee, who's not here, but thank you. And we look forward to engaging with everybody soon. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.